February 9, 1977. Gary, Indiana. A woman's voice on a telephone, clear, calm, alive. 15 minutes later, investigators would find her body cold to the touch, and the coroner would tell them she'd been dead since that afternoon. How do you speak to someone who's already been dead for 6 hours? I pulled this file 3 weeks ago. Case number 77-0892, filed February 10, 1977, Gary Police Department, Lake County, Indiana. Victim: Mitrice Richardson, 23 years old, night shift supervisor at the Mercy Hospital Laundry Facility. Single, no children, lived alone in a second-floor apartment on West 5th Avenue. The file is thin, 46 pages. Most cold cases I review run into the hundreds. This one stayed thin because investigators hit a wall they couldn't explain, and when you can't explain something, you stop writing it down. The responding officer's initial report is clinical, straightforward. He describes a welfare check requested by the victim's employer after she failed to report for her shift. He describes gaining entry through the building superintendent. He describes finding the victim deceased in the living room. What he does not describe, what no one in this file adequately describes, is how any of what they found was physically possible. I've read this report 11 times. The math doesn't work, the timeline doesn't work, the evidence contradicts itself at every turn, and that's before we get to the blood. Officers arrived at 9:47 p.m. The superintendent unlocked the main door, but the chain lock was engaged. They had to force it inside. The apartment was undisturbed. Neat, a television playing low in the corner. A half-eaten bowl of soup on the kitchen table, still slightly warm. Mitrice Richardson was lying on the living room floor between the couch and the coffee table. She was wearing a bathrobe. Her eyes were open. The first officer on scene, a patrolman named David Kowalski, noted in his report that her skin was cold and waxy. Rigor mortis had already begun setting into her jaw and neck. Her lividity, the pooling of blood that occurs after death, was fixed and pronounced along her back and legs. But here's what stopped me cold when I read it. She had a wound, a deep laceration across her left forearm, nearly to the bone, the kind of wound that severs the radial artery, the kind of wound that produces catastrophic blood loss. Officer Kowalski wrote, expected significant blood pooling, found none. The carpet beneath her was dry, her bathrobe was dry. Crime scene technicians would later luminol the entire apartment. They found trace amounts of blood near the wound itself, less than a tablespoon, and nothing else. A wound like that produces liters of blood, 4 liters, minimum, enough to soak through carpet, through padding, into the subfloor. None of it was there. The evidence log for this case lists 43 items. I've been through every single one. Item 7. 1 serrated kitchen knife. Recovered from the kitchen sink. No blood detected, no fingerprints. Item 12. 1 bowl of chicken noodle soup, partially consumed, temperature measured at approximately 95 degrees at 10:15 p.m., nearly 30 minutes after officers arrived. Item 19. The chain lock assembly from the front door. Forensic examination confirmed the chain had been engaged from the inside. The screws showed no signs of tampering. The frame showed no signs of forced manipulation prior to police entry. Item 20. 3. Samples from the victim's bathrobe. Testing detected her blood type, O negative, but only in amounts consistent with the visible wound seepage. Nothing consistent with arterial spray, nothing consistent with active bleeding. But there was one problem. The medical examiner's preliminary report estimated Mitrice had lost between 3.5 and 4 liters of blood before death. Her heart would have been pumping that blood out of the wound with considerable pressure. There should have been spray patterns on the walls, pooling on the floor. Saturation of her clothing there was none of it, and this is where the case stops making sense entirely. At 9:02 p.m., 45 minutes before police arrived, Mitrice Richardson called her mother from her apartment telephone. Phone records confirmed the call. It lasted 11 minutes. Her mother, Dorothy Richardson, described the conversation as completely normal. Mitrice talked about work, about a recipe she wanted to try that weekend, about a movie she'd seen. Her mother heard nothing unusual, no distress, no indication anything was wrong, but according to the coroner, Mitrice had been dead since approximately 3 p.m. That afternoon. I found 3 witness statements in this file. All 3 are problematic. Dorothy Richardson gave her statement the morning after. She was adamant about the phone call. She knew her daughter's voice. They spoke for 11 minutes. Mitrice was alive. The second witness was a neighbor, Gerald Patterson, who lived in the apartment directly below Mitrice's unit. He told investigators he heard her walking around at approximately 8:45 p.m. Footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, normal sounds, living sounds. The third witness was Mitrice's co-worker, Sandra Okonkwo, who called the apartment at 9:15 p.m. when Mitrice hadn't arrived for her shift. Sandra stated that Mitrice answered the phone. She sounded tired. She said she wasn't feeling well and would try to come in later. Sandra described her voice as normal, just sleepy. That call ended at 9:17 p.m. 30 minutes later, officers found her body in a state of rigor mortis that takes a minimum of 2 to 4 hours to develop. I called the Lake County Coroner's Office last month. The original medical examiner, Dr. Howard Strauss, died in 1994. His notes are sparse, but he was clear on one point: based on body temperature, lividity fixation, and rigor progression, Mitrice Richardson died no later than 4 p.m. on February 9. She could not have made those phone calls, but she did. Let me walk through this the way investigators did. 3 to 4 p.m. Mitrice Richardson dies in her apartment from blood loss due to a deep laceration on her left forearm. Her body begins cooling. Blood begins pooling along her back and legs. 8:45 p.m. A neighbor hears footsteps in her apartment. 9:02 p.m. Her mother receives an 11-minute phone call from Mitrice's home line. Phone company records confirm this call originated from the apartment. 9:15 p.m. Her coworker calls and speaks to a woman identifying herself as Mitrice. 9:47 p.m. Police enter the apartment and find Mitrice's body displaying 6 hours of post-mortem changes. Someone made those calls. Investigators considered the obvious explanation, that someone else was in the apartment, someone who answered the phone, someone who impersonated Mitrice to her own mother. But Dorothy Richardson insisted that was not possible. She knew her daughter. She knew her voice, her speech patterns, the way she laughed. She had no doubt. And there was another problem. Gerald Patterson, the downstairs neighbor, stated he heard only one set of footsteps, light footsteps consistent with Mitrice, who was 5'2" and weighed approximately 110 pounds. He heard no conversation, no second voice, no indication anyone else was present. The door was chained from the inside. No one else was there, and the blood that should have soaked every surface in that apartment, nearly 4 liters of it, was simply gone. The official theory, such as it is, lists the manner of death as undetermined. Not suicide, not homicide, not accident. Undetermined. The file contains a handwritten note from Detective Marcus Halloran, who led the investigation. He wrote, "Every explanation requires something impossible to be true." Some investigators believed Mitrice was killed elsewhere and moved back to her apartment, but that doesn't explain the chain lock. It doesn't explain the body temperature. It doesn't explain the warm soup on the table. Others theorized the coroner's time of death estimate was simply wrong, that she died much later than 4 p.m. But Dr. Strauss was experienced. His methodology was sound, and the state of rigor mortis doesn't lie. There was one theory that never made it into the official file. I found it in Detective Halloran's personal notes, donated to the Lake County Historical Society after his death in 2011. He wrote, "The simplest explanation is that she was alive when she made those calls, that she died sometime between 9:17 and 9:47. But the body says otherwise. The body says she'd been dead for hours, and the body doesn't lie." Then, at the bottom of the page, underlined, "So where did the blood go?" No one ever answered that question. The case went cold in 1979. It has never been reopened. I've reviewed hundreds of case files over the years. I've seen evidence that didn't make sense. I've seen timelines that contradicted witness statements. I've seen investigations fail because the pieces wouldn't fit together, but I have never seen a case where the evidence itself seems to defy what we know about the physical world. Mitrice Richardson was alive at 9:15 p.m. 3 people heard her voice. Her soup was still warm. She had been dead since that afternoon. Her body said so. Every medical indicator said so. And nearly 4 liters of her blood, enough to fill a 2-liter bottle twice over, vanished without a trace. Someone knows what happened in that apartment. Someone knows where that blood went. Someone knows how a dead woman answered the phone. Case status: unsolved. This file is still open. The next one I'm reviewing. You'll want to be there when I open that file.